Daniel O'Brien here today. And I think in the emails I put you down as being Harvard Sociology, which I hadn't thought of you were because you've been working with Chris Winship. But actually, you're the research director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, which is at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study. And you've also been teaching in the sociology department. And the class looks super cool. I actually clicked through and was like, oh, this class looks neat. And Daniel O'Brien received his PhD from Binghamton University in 2010. And his research is currently on neighborhoods, big data, and how much we can do with these new sources of information. So without further ado.
Thank you. And thank you guys for joining me today. So, as she said, most of my research is on urban neighborhoods, and particularly the opportunity that big data offer us in terms of studying them. And so I'm going to essentially summarize a paper that I wrote with Chris over here, Winship, and Rob Sampson, but also kind of give you some sense. So that paper was written some time ago at this point, and some sense of where we're going with it, right, and what the next steps are, because, well, even though publication times take a little bit of time to kind of happen, the work keeps going. So, but I want to start with kind of the concept of big data itself. And I know, so this was working just a moment ago, and there it is. So I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, right? Where I imagine most people in here are pretty analytical and pretty comfortable with large data sets. But you know, there's this argument, and we've all heard it, we've all seen it, and probably even been proponents of it at times, that you know, big data is going to transform our world, right? These digital traces that we leave pretty much everywhere we go, from you know, making a phone call to swiping a credit card, they're going to give us insights into human behavior and society that we've never had before, and some might even argue, tell us all that we need to know, you know. And so there's this argument there, and there's some who would definitely say that this promise has been a little bit overblown, right? Especially in cities where we know that there's all this massive information, right? These administrative data sets that tell us about, for example, every call for government service, right? This is every pothole that was called in, every street light outage, every general request, every bulk item pickup. So we know these things, and every point, right, is a discrete event or condition that we can think about and use as really relevant information, but there's a sense in which we haven't harnessed it yet, right? And we haven't completely made that jump. And so I just want to start with a video quickly that I think captures what the problem here is, because we haven't seen a complete transformation, at least within the disciplines that typically do urban science. And so this is a video made by Mauro Martino and myself, and basically it maps out all of the calls for non-essential government services, the 311 line for Boston, for the year 2011. And basically what you see, right, is an immense amount of information. Almost a shocking amount of information, right? There's about 175,000 calls in there over a pretty modest region. And, you know, there's all sorts of info, but when you look at it, it's not incredibly clear what you're actually seeing, right? There's no obvious patterns. There's a few that people have pointed out, which, you know, things like the park, there's not too many calls from inside the park, and there's not too many calls from inside the airport. But other than that, all these dots and their colors and things like that, they don't tend to tell a story on their own, at least not on the surface level. And so really the argument I want to make is that it's incumbent upon us as researchers to figure out what exactly these data are useful for, right? Because they weren't made for research originally. So then I think there's really two questions that need to be answered. One is, what in the world do they measure, right? And then second, do those measurements have any relevance to our ongoing conversations, discussions, theories, debates, etc., because otherwise they're just isolated information. So somehow we have to bring them in to the fold of the science that's been done over the past 150 years. So as was mentioned, I'm the research director for something called the Boston Area Research Initiative. And so this idea of harnessing these big data has come out of this project, which didn't originally think of itself as a big data project. But essentially, we set out to be an inter-university and interdisciplinary research partnership that pushes cutting-edge research that kind of intersects between social science and policy. And this started 3 years ago. It's directed by Rob Sampson and Chris. We have faculty representing 10 area universities. We have policymakers and practitioners from 10 government agencies. We're supported by the Radcliffe Institute, the Rapport Institute for Greater Boston across campus at the Kennedy School, and the City of Boston. And we have recent additional funding from NSF and MacArthur. But really, the guiding vision here, 2 points. Local policy should be driven by evidence-based decision-making, and behavioral science should focus on individuals and the societies they create. Right? And so you can see this obvious complementarity, right? Scientists want to study the city. We want to know what's going on. We want to know how people behave, how societies work, right? While policymakers essentially need to know those things in their day-to-day lives. So everything a scientist finds out is relevant to a policymaker. And everything a policymaker does on a day-to-day basis is relevant to that scientist understanding the makeup of the city. So our argument is basically that these two groups can converge. Now, this idea in some sense is as old as the hills, but what we've discovered is big data is a new catalyst for this, right? Because you can actually have a conversation and say, well, we're kind of interested in some of the same things, but there's 300,000 records of calls over there that can tell us something. Maybe we should just start finding out what they tell us. And that's really been the original challenge of our project, of figuring out how to drive that process forward. So our pilot project, which is really the first one, when I first started at the initiative, I was asked to figure out what does this model look like, right? And how do we do this? And so the first project was around this thing called the CRM system, also a 311 line. For kind of silly political reasons, Boston refuses to call it a 311 line, but it's the same thing. And this was instated in 2008 by the Mayor's Office for New Urban Mechanics, and it essentially made it really easy for people to request government services. You see a pothole, you call. You need someone to pick up your TV, you call. You know, and very straightforward, and it's become very popular, right? It now archives over 300 requests a day, and sometimes as many as 500 to 600 requests in a day, right? There's a lot of requests coming in, and likewise, there's a lot of information there, right? A lot of data. And these data tell you all sorts of things about what's going on, right? It tells you where the potholes are. It tells you, somewhat more importantly, where the graffiti is, right? Where people are throwing trash on the street and someone else is calling to have it swept up. It's really telling you quite a bit.
Do we know how much of each of those individual observations is independent of the others? Like if there's a pothole and you're calling and I'm calling about the same pothole, then we're not really, it's 300 requests, but it's really, one data point.
That's a great question. Anecdotally, we understand that there are some of those, but not a lot of duplicates. I have some students working right now on writing an algorithm to try to identify them. And I'll get to in a little bit the point of, because that really raises the question of validity, and I'll be getting to that, how we're trying to handle that. And so essentially, we thought, well, couldn't we leverage this for the study of broken windows, right? A physical disorder. Could this possibly be a tool for basically being the eyes and ears of the city? Could we see into neighborhoods and see physical conditions without ever leaving our desks? Right? And so that's really been the impetus for this whole project. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the history of urban research, which I imagine some of you are not, so basically physical disorder is really the oldest measure of in urban research. This guy Charles Booth in the 19th century London, he mapped out every block in London according to aspects of its deterioration, and also things like prostitution and low income, but noting particularly where there were falling apart houses, where there was litter on the streets, poor sanitation, etc. Jane Jacobs made a big point about this in her work in the 50s and 60s, talking about cities, particularly New York. Really made a point that disorder is an important symptom of whether a neighborhood is working or not. And many of you have probably heard of the Broken Windows essay from the 1980s in The Atlantic that Wilson and Kelling wrote. And they actually took this a step further, positing that disorder even has a causal role, right? That disorder is driving certain behaviors and, in fact, precipitating what one would call a cycle of disorder and decline. So this is really sort of one of the oldest questions in urban science. So it seemed really this kind of a perfect opportunity to bring in a big data set to this field would be to go in this direction, to look at physical disorder. So it brings me to the question of ecometrics, which is a really popular methodology in urban science over the last 20 years. It was first introduced by Stephen Raudenbush and Rob Sampson in the 90s in their work in Chicago. And essentially, it's just measuring the conditions of the physical and social ecology of a neighborhood, right? And there's a lot of challenges to this because you have to make sure your measurements are reliable, that you're getting a good range of items and you're actually covering dimensions in particular. But essentially, the logic goes like this, right? the neighborhoods of a city vary, right? That's Charlestown. You've got this nice, tidy street. You've got this housing project in South Boston. You've got this suburban area in Roslindale. And essentially, you're looking, intuitively at very different places. But then the question is, how do you measure those differences? How do you define the dimensions that they vary on? And how do you actually quantify them, right? And access that information so that you can then analyze it. So the original approach to this was surveys. This was first done by Wes Scogan in Chicago in the 1980s. Now these neighborhood to tell you what the neighborhood is like, what it looks like, how people around here behave. These are useful, although it turns out that surveys about the objective physical environment tend to be skewed by quite a few other factors, including racism, essentially, perceptions of the racial proportions of the neighborhood. Another approach has been neighborhood audits. Send research assistants, graduate students, undergraduates out into neighborhoods and have them systematically, measure conditions. As you can imagine, this takes a lot of work and a lot of money. Another approach is taking that, kind of putting that on steroids and driving a van up and down streets. So Rob and his project in Chicago in the 90s drove a van up and down 20,000 street blocks and videotaped the conditions that were being seen from the sides of the van. And then again, undergraduates and graduates watched all of those videos. I can't imagine how boring that was, and coded them. And so then grab data from that. Again, a lot of money, a lot of time and resources. And so then the question is, can we leverage this to do something similar, if not the same? Right? Can we get these same measures somehow from this real-time data source that's coming directly into the Department of Innovation and Technology at the city, right? This is coming straight into the city and essentially leveraging people's calls as the eyes and ears of the city. So the argument basically goes, this could really be transformative. Does administrative data allow inexpensive measurement? They're constantly coming in, and so while one outing, one full coverage costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, this is coming straight into the continuous data collection allows longitudinal tracking, right? No city has been measured twice in 10 years, continuously over time, every year, every 2 years, remeasure. There may be things in these data sets that we've never had direct access to by walking down a street, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but for example, private conditions, right? You have to infer them by looking at the front porch, but you cannot get inside the house as a researcher, but these data may allow us to do things like that.
Yeah. So it seems like this is a good argument for being able to make inferences about within neighborhood variation over time. But I'm a little bit skeptical, given the setup, about the sort of cross-sectional variation, because if I live in a neighborhood that has always had potholes, I'm just not calling in 311 about that, right?
Yeah.
And so there's going to be sort of variation across neighborhoods about the sort of types of things that seem abnormal to you, and hence would lead to the data generation into a 311 system.
Yeah.
The within variation, you're golden on, right? And I think that's really interesting. But
Actually,
how to conceptualize the across variation, because the normal is very different. I mean, that's exactly why the survey methods also had this problem, unless you're using the vignette method or something like that.
Yeah, and actually, I would disagree. I think the within is just as vulnerable, because if those patterns change in reporting over time. But that's actually, so as we move forward, that's exactly one of the questions we're going to address here. So essentially, yeah.
So Rob collects 20,000 blocks of data analysis per million fast.
Yeah.
And now you go to Google Street View and get it for free.
Yeah.
So let's just do that.
It doesn't update.
Was it?
Doesn't update, and you also still have.
You just don't know exactly when.
Yeah, and you still also have to have somebody go in and code those. So that, I think there isn't writing codes that can recognize certain things in the image, right? Machine learning to, that's a pile of litter, graffiti. The other problem is Google has agreements with certain cities to clean those up. You cannot see, I've walked around on Google Street View, neighborhoods that I know personally walking around have problems all over the place. You can't see them unless you find an abandoned building. That's really the only case that's obvious. You can see, well, so basically, if you walk around, that's a good question. I know that they have been asked to clean up things like street punks, kids sitting on a corner not looking particularly or looking somewhat menacing. But other things like trash, right? If you do a neighborhood audit and you walk, really what you're looking for is consistent coverage on the edge, right? So it's not going to be as visible in these images unless you can zoom in on lower resolution. So I really think the Google argument, while useful, and Rob actually has a paper on this for some things, I think it has its serious disadvantages.
Is it clear what it is you actually want to measure?
In
Or is it sort of, like, I'm not quite sure what the, like, if you had infinite time and resources, what your measure would be.
That's a really good question. And you know what, the field doesn't entirely know, right? So physical disorder has been defined by what you could access by walking down a street, right? But people would certainly argue that, well, if you could figure out if there's problems inside the building, that would be great to know too, but how would you get that, right? And so,
So let's just take, so that's a fine distinction.
yeah,
So let's just say physical disorder that you would see by walking down the street.
yeah.
But what does that mean exactly? So if you're walking down a farm lane where there's nothing on the street, there's no buildings at all, is that disordered?
There's been some efforts. I saw one paper. I don't think I got put to measure that tried to measure disorder in rural. Yeah, was these particularly what they were focusing on was in this particular area is a lot of pig farms, and did people hide their basically the giant collections of pig manure? Did they hide them from the street?
So that's pretty well defined, right? That's a well-defined question. Is there pigment on the street?
Yeah, but you need them to really I mean, yes, it's a reasonably defined thing, but you need multiple measures, right? You need multiple items
Before we have a measure up, we should know what it is we're trying to measure.
of deterioration and neglect
Of what?
of the physical spaces.
So of stuff that was built. So in other words, different streets have different things that were built. And,
Yeah.
and sort of intended to be, okay. And how much of when they break, or stuff, anything built that actually breaks, was it fixed or not fixed? Is that sort of?
Yeah, more or less. But there's also the additional angle of direct denigration, right? Graffiti, throwing trash on the ground, right? So and those are included in there. And in fact, some would argue that those were the original impetus for the model, right?
What if you have a street where there's no trash? It's just like a bunch of really cheap houses.
Yeah.
And you have another street with really expensive houses and no trash, and nothing appropriate in each street. Is that 100%?
They're equivalent. It has nothing to do with income.
So let's do it even more. The first street, they put very little effort in, but no, they use tinker toilets. And the other one, they put a lot of effort in. Is one more disordered than the other?
No, that's a different dimension. That's something that's been measured not too often, but Margaret Coffey and some of her colleagues down in Texas have developed a metric for walking down streets and measuring decoration, as they use it as a signal of territoriality. But for physical disorder, it's very specifically a 0 to negative infinity measure, right? In terms of this being a bad thing, right? So basically, you're either kept up with no extra bells and whistles, or you're going down from there, right? Things are falling apart. There's litter on the streets. There's graffiti. People.
Kept up means very different things in different places.
Yes, but when I mean kept up, I literally mean just saving face. I don't mean adding anything to it. Putting an American flag out front, putting a troll on the lawn, putting up Christmas decorations. Some people might call that being kept up, but that's not what we're measuring here. That's not part of the construct.
It would be very fair, like a lawn that is perfectly being would that make a difference?
So if a lawn, so when I've done this in direct audits, we do assess lawns, right? Is the lawn overgrown in some fashion, right? And so the auditors go and they rate on a 1 to 5 scale how well kept is the lawn, right? And that to me isn't decoration until you start putting things on it.
No, but that's a very clear measure. So you could walk every street, whenever there's a lawn, you could measure this. You could measure the gorilla, right? And it's kind of straightforward. But if one street has a lawn and another street is cement, I'm just not sure what it is, what the quantity measures is. I have vague sense because but I'm just not quite sure what it is.
I mean, the best I can give you right now, without going through a lengthy history of the methodologies that have been used, is simply indicators of deterioration, neglect, and denigration in physical space. So, okay.
Yeah, how did Google actually come up with things, or we go out and do another run?
Give haircuts to the kids.
That's a good question. I don't know. I've heard this from, from public policy folks who have said that, there, in various cities, there have been calls made to not make particular neighborhoods look as blighted because it's killing the city sort of thing. But that's all I have. I've never asked a Google person what they do. Okay, so basically, jumping back over, right, there's a big challenge here, and I think this was captured by the comment back there. Right? These data weren't created for research purposes. They don't have some of the niceties that we're accustomed to. And so I think there's really three things that we need to address, and we summarize this in the paper. And so the first one is simply content. This is to Gary's point. What is it we're trying to measure, right? There's a whole lot in this data set that has nothing to do with physical disorder, right? If I call in because I want to know the mayor's birthday, that still goes into the file. And that has nothing to do with the upkeep of my neighborhood. The second one is validity, right? Do these cases measure real conditions? This information was not collected objectively through a protocol. It's coming in through a screen, and that screen is people choosing to call them in. And third, reliability, which I'll probably spend the least time on, but it's an important consideration, even though big data are, well, big, and therefore they tend to be pretty they tend to create robust measures. You do have to consider the fact that there's no criteria for the geographic scale or the temporal scale that you really should be measuring on. And so you have to establish that once you actually have measures. So we took a database of cases about 2 years and 3 months or so, 335,000 calls, and each one is a single record, right, with the date and time, address or intersection, a standardized case type, so this is standardized by the person receiving the call, based on what the nature of the service is, and generally speaking, they are reflective of ground truth. And there's an anonymous caller identifier, which I'll come back to later, but that's useful for a number of the analyses that we do. And we do the analysis using census block groups. Right? So we break up the city into 543 units. So we start out with 178 of these standardized case types, right? And as I said, a lot of them are not really related to physical disorder. In fact, we went through, we only identified 34 that were at all relevant, right? And so what we basically want to know was, did these 34 create a single dimension of physical disorder, which is the tradition in the literature, you just measure physical disorder, or do they actually break out into separate dimensions? Because 34 is a lot of indicators. And so what we did was we counted them up, we aggregated them up to the census block group level, and we ran factor analysis on them, looking at how they correlated in space. And we found 5 categories that emerged. And these were housing issues, so things like unsatisfactory living conditions, failing utilities, pests of various sorts, be they insect or mammal, uncivil use of space, which is a term we're using to refer to basically things you're doing with private space that are impacting the rest of the neighborhood, and other people are noticing and it's problematic. Illegal rooming house, poor conditions of property. That particular call is specific to when a neighbor calls and complains about the conditions of your property. Parking illegally on your yard, things of that nature. Big buildings, which is another set of cases that have to do with people complaining about the management of condo and apartment buildings and the effect they're having on the space around them. Inappropriate storage or dumping of trash and the things that come along with that, including rodent activity in the street, and graffiti removal. So 2 different calls for that, one from constituents and one from employees tracking graffiti across the city. So we have these 5 categories, and looking at them, the correlations were interesting. They definitely did not make a single metric. In fact, they seem to create 2 dimensions here. And one was what one might call private neglect. So big buildings, uncivil use of space, and housing issues all hung together nicely, and they all indicate some misuse of a private space. And then public denigration, trash and graffiti, both of which clearly indicate a direct denigration to a public space. It's not necessarily that you did something wrong in your private
Wait, so
space.
you ran a factor analysis to get from 36 to 5, and then you ran another factor analysis on the 5 to get to the 2? Is that...
More or less, but the place I'd be specific is the first one was an exploratory factor analysis. This was a confirmatory. So we basically looked at the 5 dimensions and said, well, this seems to be suggesting something. Let's test it.
So if there's a lot of complaints in the neighborhood, is that neighborhood a sort of disaster area, or is that neighborhood a really good area where people have very high standards?
We're about to get to that. Yeah, that's part 2. So validity. to Gary's call specifically, or question specifically, does the archive of calls accurately reflect real conditions, right? And simply put, right, you have a streetlight outage down Jamaica Plain, gets called in. You have a streetlight outage over in South Boston, does not get called in. As far as the database is concerned, there's no call from South Boston, right? There's no streetlight outage there. And so this could be a real issue, right? If there are patterns in calling across neighborhoods that are systematic, where some neighborhoods are calling in double, triple, 300 times for the same thing, and other neighborhoods are just kind of letting every other problem or 3 out of every 4 problem sit, then you have a problem, right? Your data are not objective representations of reality. So what we need to do is we need to develop what we call an adjustment factor, based on what we call the civic response rate. And so we went out, my students and I, we walked around at night for an entire summer and identified streetlight outages. Walking around Roxbury at 9 o'clock at night may not have been the smartest move I've ever made in my life, but interestingly enough, if 2 white guys are walking around in a 100% minority blighted neighborhood with clipboards, they think you're cops. And we were asked repeatedly if we were police or working for the government, which is very interesting. But anyway, at the same time, Public Works was assessing quality of sidewalks, and so what we were able to do was take all of these audits and this information and cross-reference it with the CRM database to figure out how quickly or how often these things were called in. And then this gave us an objective measure of the response rate.
Did you know when the streetlights actually went out?
No, we weren't able to do that. So what we basically were able to do, though, was measure from the time found how long did it take. But
It's an shot. It's an experimental study.
I know, I pitched that one and nobody would hear me at City Hall. They told me I couldn't do it. And then what we decided we wanted to do was more than just assess the civic response rate and adjust for one time. We wanted to be able to do this repeatedly, right? Otherwise, you don't have a methodology, a replicable methodology. So what we did was we grabbed a bunch of additional measures from within the CRM database to estimate civic response rate, which I'll get into more in a moment. And actually, because we're running late, I might need to truncate that part a little bit. But and then last, we calibrated our final measure of disorder, right, which took the civic response rate and used it to turn the volume up or down on calls based on this argument. Some places have a lot of calls because a lot of people just want to call. Used that to adjust things, and then we were able to calibrate that against another objective measure of disorder. This one was street litter, in order to figure out just how important the adjustment factor was and how strong of an influence it should have on a given metric. So very quickly, we estimated the civic response rate. We believe that it had 2 components. One, engagement, right, whether people actually know of the system, and the other one, concern for public space. And then we used 2 major features of the database. We distinguished between needs that were in the public space and needs that were private. So things like, if I have a TV that I need to throw out and I'm calling for bulk item pickup, that's a private need, right? That's not for the public domain. But if I'm calling in a pothole, that's me taking responsibility of something that's in the commons, right? And so we figured that would be a relevant thing when thinking about concern for public space. And we were able to use the anonymous code indicating identity of caller. So we're actually able to create a distribution of individuals using the system across the city and a profile for each of those individuals, which then could tell us, right, what the overall structure of the neighborhood's caller population was, and if that influenced or not calling patterns. So I'm going to jump through a little bit so that we can get all the way through. But essentially, we did a path analysis to assess what was relevant here in predicting the objective measures of response rate. And it turns out it was concern for public space, right? And is made up of 2 measures regarding the nature of the people there making publics. So we have this nice model where then we actually can take these guys, create a measure based on them, and then use that as a repeated adjustment factor within the system. So essentially, you take the raw counts, and then you use these 2 measures to either turn the volume up or down in order to adjust to what the objective conditions actually are. Some fun stuff there. Okay, skip that. And then the last thing we need to do to assess validity was do some construct validity work, right? Take a whole bunch of other measures and see if they correlate appropriately. And so what we found was the private neglect and public denigration measures held all the correlations that they were supposed to at reasonable strengths. And so really giving some good evidence that these measures in the end were valid, right? They were reflecting objective conditions the way they were supposed to. They were negatively correlated with affluence. They were positively correlated with minority population, which, as we all know, minority neighborhoods tend to have more flight. They were negatively correlated with a strong social community, collective efficacy. They were positively correlated with people's perceptions of physical disorder in the neighborhood, which, as I said, we know are a little bit skewed themselves. And they're positively correlated with crime. So all of this was very promising. And then as a last step, reliability, we basically wanted to know, now that we have measures, how often can they be measured and for what geographical scale? And so we use multi-level models to assess consistency of measures at different time windows. I can talk more about this, but basically using interclass coefficients and reliabilities. We figured out the reliabilities basically were over 0.8, and all of our interclass correlations were over 0.5 for these thresholds. We were able to measure every 6 months for census block groups, which was our original unit of analysis here, which is where about 1,000 people live. There's 540 in the city, so they're relatively modest in size. And every 2 months, census tracts, which are the more traditional for urban research. And so you might remember me mentioning earlier, right, we've never been able to measure a city more than once in 10 years before. Now we're measuring it repeatedly in a year, which really sort of changes the game and the opportunities that you can do. So our final measures were 5 lower order and 2 higher order measures of physical disorder. We take the counts of cases from specific case types. We adjust them using estimates of the civic response rate, and we can measure at intervals as small as 2 months. And so it's multidimensional, which is great because no one has ever measured physical disorder objectively as more than a single dimension. It's nearly costless at this point. Now that everything's been done, all this hard work has been done, I literally can get an email from or a data drop from the city of Boston, and within half an hour have new measures just by running the code. And so actually we did that for the 2013 data recently. So it's basically, regular updates of the measurement, and it's continuous across time and space.
But how does that exactly work? The whole reason this works, that I understand, is that you're able to combine the call data with your canvassing data that you did at some point, right? And that then lets you make an estimate. But how do we know that the canvassing estimates that you got are going to maintain across time?
So there's a reasonable point there in the sense that eventually we should replicate. But remember that from this slide, right, we intentionally analyzed the canvassing in terms of other metrics coming from within the system that were independent of physical disorder. And so those themselves...
They were related to physical disorder, not independent.
Okay, that's probably more...
Separate.
Yeah, they're separate from physical disorder. They're not part of our physical disorder measure. And so using those, we're actually able to replicate those measures.
So those things get updated over time.
Exactly. So those things consistently get updated. Now, eventually, you're right. A couple years from now, we probably should do another audit and make sure that these hold. That would be the right thing to do.
It's still the same level of assumption, right? Now it's not of the absence of measurable variables, so it's still an assumption.
There's still an assumption. I wouldn't call it the same level of assumption, though.
You're assuming over time.
Which is different from assuming an objective relationship with something between which there was a screen, right? And so that is a much more damning challenge than assuming constancy in something that, and I wouldn't call it an unknown, I would call it a not remeasured. So it is known.
Well, the correlations you pointed there, what you're saying is you're using those in order to reconstruct, if I'm interpreting you right, that you're using those to reconstruct the thing that you did from, the effortful thing you did by walking through the streets.
So you mean these parameters?
Yeah.
Yeah, so these parameters are now in a model in order to construct the adjusted
Right.
measures.
So now you're going to assume that those in 0.52 and 0.74 remain constant over time.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an assumption.
It is an assumption.
There have to be some assumptions here.
Yeah, No, no, I agree with you. I was just defending I was disagreeing on the level of the assumption. I think that that's less of an assumption than assuming that these calls are objective reflections of
And I'm
reality.
cool with you saying that, but we have to recognize that you said.
And for that reason, and that's why I do kind of so that is definitely important.
Are they complementary, like Twitter, a lot of things that people talk and mention about culture?
That's a
People
really good
have
question.
I mean, you could calibrate it with other.
That's a really good question, and we need to look into that. One thing we're looking at right now is so with the graffiti, for example, right? There's resident calls and there's constituent calls. That's the same thing. Resident calls and government calls. The ratio between those two could be really informative, right? About 80% of the city is either in the high or low or medium category, right? Where the calls from the residents agree completely with the calls from the government. But what about those neighborhoods where there's a lot of government calls for graffiti and there's very few resident calls, or vice versa? So as you're saying, right, there's other things out there that we should be using and thinking about to recalibrate this. So you're right. We need to keep digging, and keep refining this. All right. So just to kind of wrap up and allow time for questions here, I just want to tell you guys about next steps.
You said 1:30.
Put it 1:30.
That's not a requirement. It's not a requirement.
Okay. Well then,
I'm sure we'll have lots of questions.
well then,
That's an upper bound.
yeah. Well then, my misunderstanding of this means that I have managed to get us near the end a little bit quickly. So we'll have plenty of time to keep debating. That's good. Okay. Well then I'll just tell you guys about next steps and give myself a little bit of breath to do so, and then we can pause for talking about this. So essentially, the first next step really is the multi-database library of ecometrics. Right? We've developed one thing here for starters, and in fact, I'd argue more than one. Right? We've developed physical disorder and in fact engagement and care for space. We've got all of these new metrics. Some of them are replications of old metrics, but actually the engagement and care for space ones are brand new. No one's been able to measure that before, because imagine how difficult it would be to measure the tendency of the members of a neighborhood to call in a problem by sitting on a street corner, right, or driving up and down a street. You'd have to be there for hours upon hours just to get a handful of events, and then you're only getting one neighborhood. So almost impossible, something we've never been able to measure before. And I think this logic of the opportunity expands to pretty much any other administrative data set that's out there. If this methodology gets extended to them, right, you can start to think of new metrics that are available and just waiting to be mined, so to speak. So we've already started with the 911 system. We've managed to use that in a similar way to develop measures of social disorder and crime. Again, multi-dimensional measures that are more sophisticated than what's been used in the past. And this is actually already the centerpiece of a paper that we have under review right now. I have a student right now who's doing a great project. He's using building permits to look at investment and growth across neighborhoods. And so it's a very interesting project. He's managed to differentiate between two types of growth, one of which is like big projects, right? Things being knocked down, other things being built up. And if you look at the map for that, which I can show you in a moment, if you look at the map, it basically clusters in the Innovation District over in South Boston, downtown, regions where, I can't remember which college, we can look in a moment, where one of the colleges has been building, one of the universities, But on the other hand, he's managed to isolate then people doing work on their houses, additions and renovations, real simple stuff that is an indicator of someone investing in the neighborhood. And now there is the argument about gentrification, of course, but even a gentrifying landlord is investing in the neighborhood and trying to change the nature of its social patterns. So that's a great project I'm really excited about. We also have a master's student right now who's using an events archive from Arts Boston. So basically a calendar of all the cultural events in the greater Boston area to measure cultural vibrancy. And if more information about the neighborhoods and the regions of a city becomes available, you start to be able to create that you never had access to before. Now, as that's the case, right, you have, and as you all know, right, the more variables you have, the more hypotheses you can test, exponentially so. And all of these are longitudinal, right? And so you start to be able to test these hypotheses, but specifically you start to be able to examine dynamic relationships, right? Technically, all theories of neighborhood change, right, or really all theories of neighborhood are causal models, right? They're longitudinal models of, what the the neighborhood looks at like at time 1 is going to predict what the neighborhood looks like at time 2 and time 3. Traditionally, we have a hard time doing this, right? Because back to the earlier stuff about how hard it is to measure the neighborhoods of a city, we're kind of stuck with cross-sectional data most of the time. And so we're analyzing almost all of our hypotheses based on cross-sectional data and then assumptions of the idea that these relationships compound over time. But now we actually have a real opportunity to take lots of data sets that are longitudinal and start examining change in relationships. One project we've been working on has to do with broken windows, and the idea that disorder leads to, and this is sort of the classic, as I mentioned earlier, this cycle of disorder and have multiple one data sets, and we have all sorts of measures, or 3 different measures of violence that we can examine. And so you start to be a nuanced model of how the neighborhood changes over time, and really which things lead to which other things, and how that can then inform everything from just our basic theoretical understanding of the neighborhood, of people's behavioral patterns in response to these stressful environments, but also how you would approach it as a policymaker, right? And what we actually find is kind of the keystone to this model is this private conflict measure, which is a measure of people getting into domestic disputes, landlords and tenants arguing about things, violent restraining orders, and things of that nature. And this turns out to be the kingpin of the model, right? There's a lot of other little causal relationships across time, but it seems to be that this is really the strongest part of the neighborhood, and in fact, you don't want to target what's happening in the public space. You want to target people's relationships if you're a policymaker. And so really kind of thinking about ideas of how do you help a neighborhood help itself sort of thing, and what's really the centerpiece. Drilling down to microspatial patterns, right? Today I've kind of kept with tradition of urban theory in trying to measure neighborhoods, but there's a lot more than just, this blanket idea of a neighborhood. There's variation within neighborhoods, right? So this is a map of all the calls for private neglect within a region called Bowdoin-Geneva, which is known to be one of the toughest parts of Boston. And so what you see here is, right, you see real hotspots, a region down here, region over here, this building is pretty unhappy, and this one as well. But then you see this whole other region over here, which is being condemned in some sense as part of Bowdoin-Geneva that has pretty limited problems in this regard. And so I really think there's a great opportunity to sort of dig down and start to think about this interplay between more microspatial events, right? How a particular house or street block is operating in relation to the rest of the neighborhood, and then how that is fueling either generalized or localized patterns. And that's really exciting. We're working right now with Cynthia Rudin at MIT on this sort of work and trying to figure out what that looks like. And then sharing measures with community stakeholders. This is one of Bari's big things. And I haven't talked about this too much today, but this was all done in partnership with the city of Boston, the Department of Innovation and Technology, the people who direct the Constituent Relationship Management System, and of course Chris Osgood and Nigel Jacob at the Mayor's Office for Newer Mechanics. So a big part of this is how do we share this knowledge and this intelligence with them? And so we have this platform, Boston Mapped, which is an instantiation of World Map, which is built right downstairs by Ben Lewis, Wendy Wan, and their team at the Center for Geographic Analysis. And we're basically putting all of our metrics, once we're relatively confident that they are publishable, so to speak, we're putting them up so people can go on, and whether they're a researcher who wants to download the data and test their own questions, or they're just someone who works at a CDC in Dorchester and wants to write a grant to say, this particular part of the neighborhood is blighted and we need government support to, do this spring cleaning project or something like that. Making it fully accessible to all those levels of engagement, and really working on that. I don't think I have the slide here, but we've also been talking with City Hall about what the metrics on a mayor's dashboard would look like. Because one thing that they've had a real problem with is, right, there's 178 cases. And when you map 178 cases, you get gobbledygook, right? All you really find out is where people live. And so they've had a really hard time turning that into a dashboard from inside the building that can tell everyone, well, we should be looking at this now, things going on here, and so on and so forth. And so we've been helping them to try to repurpose these metrics to kind of harness their data, right? To domesticate it to a certain extent and make it informative. So that's been a really kind of rich conversation. Um, all right, so just to wrap up quickly, so just to acknowledge some research partners here, co-authors, obviously Chris and Rob, also Eric Gordon and Jesse Baldwin Filippi, partners at the Engagement Game Lab at Emerson, the BARI leadership, other faculty members and administrators who have been working on the project and have been helpful in kind of crafting our collaborative mission, and a handful of undergraduate and graduate fellows who have been integral in managing and working on the data with me. Policy collaborators include the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Mechanics, as I mentioned, the CRM system itself, Justin Holmes, who's actually now the interim director of the Department of Innovation and Technology, and that department itself, which is where all the data sits, and Bill Oates, who was the former director and CIO at that time, and Kurt Savoy, who's been really, his term is principal data scientist. He's been kind of integral in accessing and working through the data together. All right, and with that, thank you very much, and I guess I'll pause for further question and debate.
Thanks, really interesting. So I'm wondering, what type of community outreach you've done, or whether you've looked at actual residents as a way to sort of validate some of these measures. And I can see a real difference in your tendency to call in a broken streetlight versus call 311 to report a neighbor, and how the social engagement, whatever that adjustment factor, that you might have different incentives for calling in different types of things.
Might differ across measures.
Right, and then if your model is showing family or domestic conflicts is the main thing, I see people being very hesitant for neighborhoods to call that in. So have you engaged with residents or met with people, shown them the data, and is this reality?
That's a really interesting question. By reality, I guess you're assumed that that engagement is constant
So just to
across.
gather like, neighborhood groups, people who actually live in some small enough city, gather groups of residents and say, this is how disordered we think the neighborhood is on these dimensions. Do you think that this block compared to that block, this building compared to that building?
Well, we do have the neighborhood survey,
Right.
which I showed earlier, and that is essentially, it's not group conversations, but it's individuals reporting. So that I think in some sense would be what you're getting at. I do think there is an important assumption here that we made at the outset that I'm less confident of now, and I think it's going to spark some future work, which is the question of, do all of these calls have a similar kind of response rate? Do their response rates correlate at, one, really it's the assumption, across neighborhoods? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. In fact, so the graffiti thing I was explaining to Mercedes' question, that's a follow-up study, right? We're going to go collect audits of graffiti and compare it and see if we can get a very specific measure of adjusting graffiti up and down. Because, while we have evidence that this adjustment factor, actually, I'll go back to it, that it works across the different metrics, there very well may be sort of more specific things that reference each particular metric, right? So, for example, what we did was we compared each of our 5 to the distribution of garbage across neighborhoods, and as you can see, some things correlated way higher with it than others. To be honest, in the physical disorder literature, a correlation of about 0.3 to 0.4 is standard. So the housing correlated really highly, and this is before we adjusted, and then other things a little bit lower. But once we introduced the adjustment factor, we actually managed to, particularly for graffiti and trash, remarkably increase things. So we saw that the adjustment factor worked across everything, right? Everything had some help, so to speak, in becoming more objective. But, that's not to say that the work is done. So it may be that there's some specificity.
What number got bigger? The numbers got smaller.
So all of these got bigger. All of these. The total R squared. These numbers either stayed about the same or became stronger, and these are negative feature of the interaction with the adjustment factor.
What's garbage percentage?
Garbage was measured by walking up and down streets.
So this
and,
is
yeah, that was an audit. So the same study as the streetlight outage. So the students were looking for streetlight outages, but also grading garbage on a 1 to 5 level.
So I want to go back to Gary's BB gun example, right? basically two things. First, you can revisit that site and see how much denigration actually happened, but then you can also see how much of a call response rate is happening for those targeted areas, right? And the city would love this because what they're getting out of this is they're getting interventions of stuff being cleaned up as opposed to streetlights being shot out.
That is preferable.
That is, I think. But then you're also able to use that intervention as a way to then like further calibrate this. And it might be, I don't know, I mean, we'd have to like think through this more. It might be that you don't actually have to go do another whole audit. You can actually use a method like this to sort of target a smaller set of areas, and because it's randomly sampled, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Yeah, I do. Right. Now you'd have to like where I'm cautious in that suggestion is, you know, what the criticism would be is like an exclusion restriction violation, right? Where it's like your intervention sort of changes the way the community thinks about taking care of itself because it's like the outside world cares about me and so on. So that's like, I mean, that's it's like an exclusion restriction type of violation. So you'd have to think, you know, maybe you all clean up at night so nobody can see you.
Nobody knows.
If they're gonna go with students anyway to watch what lights are off or on, might as well pick up the sky. Right, you were okay. You were all night there.
You know, I survived one summer of having students walk around in neighborhoods at night. I don't think I'm dance with that particular devil again. And yeah, I think we spent the whole summer waiting for the call of the first kid who called me and said, "Dan, I got mugged." You know, so I would agree with you. There's an issue here of yes, you would be messing with the social structure. I like the idea. I'd have to think too about, so there's this interesting research by from the early 90s. I can't blank on his first name, but Cialdini. He's a social psychologist, and he did a study where he wanted to see if people would litter more in a littered or non-littered space. And basically he found that once you had more than 2 or 3 pieces of litter on the ground, people were much more likely to just throw litter. But what he found in one of the interesting parts of the study, which was kind of accidental, was that in one particular treatment, they had a setting that wasn't quite clean, but it had been swept. And so there was a lot of litter, but it was all swept to the side. And people in that environment didn't litter at all, and even remarkably dropped. And so there's this interesting argument, and this has been kind of built up by a guy named Keith Kaiser over the last 5 years, where if you demonstrably fix things up and people notice it, even if they don't see you doing it, but they notice it and it's different, they behave differently. And they start to become more civic-minded, at least for a short amount of time. So there would be a buffer period, at least, before someone starts throwing litter on the ground again, where people's behaviors would change, and maybe you would see. I mean, I actually thought about how we might analyze this, but you know, maybe you would suddenly see people would be more likely to notice the pothole that you couldn't clean up, you know, because all the trash was cleaned up. So I think that would be a little bit of a confounder, but it is a very interesting question. Right? How do we experimentally probe this? Yeah, like that.
And an extension, connection, and a causal sphere problem. The extension I was interested in would be views for order within institutions. So inside public schools, as the amount of graffiti or how things are taken care of. Inside hospitals, inside universities. A connection. So a big issue in Iraq was garbage pickup around the cities, and the civil affairs groups worked very hard to coordinate the pickup of garbage. And I was curious if you had ever made contact with people who've done civil affairs work or counterinsurgency work, and the evaluation of, say, Fallujah or Ramadi.
Okay, so he's saying you're going to go to Fallujah and walk around at night.
As long as you wear it, you should be okay.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I hear that goes well over there.
What I asked is there was a slide you had with the 2 spheres of sort of the property impact and then the criminal aspect, and
Yeah.
I thought you were maybe missing the public responsiveness sphere. So if you call and you actually get a response,
Yeah.
this is timely and effective and all this, you might want to call again. I kept thinking to myself, the public enemy, 911 is a joke.
Yeah.
And so after a while, you just got so much.
That's a very interesting point. We're trying to get at that with the 911 data, but what I can tell you is that the correlations between the 911 measures, which are public social disorder, private conflict, public violence, and guns,
correlation between those and income and minorities are off the charts. We're talking like 0.6, 0.7. So
And I was curious if you added a spear to this of like the resources of the city of Boston, who's being serviced
yeah,
and how responsive to a call are they?
that's a really good question. And Ryan may have been doing more work on this than I have, because I'm not a management person, so I haven't looked too much at that. One thing that actually is quote unquote disappointing about this from an experimental point of view is that because about delivering services in this very technocratic kind of way, they've become remarkably consistent. And now Ryan, I don't know if you looked at this. I know Melissa was telling me a little bit.
We have, and I would say that right now everything looks like a big mess. I wouldn't draw any conclusions, but we do see inconsistency. And our initial take was it was correlated with margin of election as political scientists were interested in. It appeared that people that need to win delivery services somehow manage to get services delivered faster in their districts on the city council level. So there is nothing consistent there. We're seeing something, but
Okay.
as you know, this data can be messy and not meant to look at.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put too much on that.
I'm excited about your project. Good luck.
Thank you.
So I had a question, going back to something you said a couple minutes ago about it being more civic-friendly. And I guess it occurs to me that there are a couple ways to quantitate this data, right? And so today we've heard a lot about trying to get objective measures about what's happening on the ground. But we might also be interested in like the kind of noisy problems of this like street, which is we might be interested in using as an output measure. And I've seen a couple papers on this. One is but how should we think about public policy in like that? Do you have thoughts on like what kind of activities we do?
Yes, and that's a whole separate talk that I'm giving tomorrow, oddly enough. So the way I think about this is in terms of, I think of it as, my background is actually individual behavior, so I'm really more a psychologist than a sociologist in some ways. So thinking about this in terms of a behavior, I've been calling it custodianship, and as sort of an expression of territoriality, right? So a care for space and a desire to take action in its stewardship and its maintenance. And what we find using the identifiable callers is that the median distance from one's home to make a call is, or for services to be delivered, is about 1 meter. So essentially what that's telling us is that people are calling almost exclusively about things that are like right out in front of their houses or within a couple houses. Right? People are not, so what's interesting is the original vision of this system, especially when they introduced, I shouldn't talk about the iPhone app, that you could take a picture of graffiti and call it in, that they would have these roving civic-minded people running around the city, calling in everything they saw. And there are a handful of those in the data. There are people, it turns out Mayor Menino is one of them. But so you have a handful of those, but in all reality, 90% of people who made a call only made 2 or fewer, and 76% of those made 1 over the course of a year. And so people are calling like literally about what very much matters to them and is anchored by their home. And so we've done some surveys. We did a survey last year with Emerson College, actually asking people who use the system about their perception of their neighborhood, about why they use it. And what we find really is that the main motivator for using it is communitarianism. I care about my neighborhood. I want to help out. But even that doesn't expand people's geographical range. And so you basically have 90% of people making all of their calls about problems that are within 2 blocks of their home.
And that sounds like total social desirability bias on getting survey results that say it's communitarian and then having the actual data be like economics 101, right? Calling about things in which they directly affect you and which you exclude benefits to other people, right? And not calling in things that are about public goods.
True. I mean, that's a reasonable argument. So what we were able to do is compare custodians, so people who made a public call or more, to people who never did, right? People who called general request, bulk item pickup. So we were able to keep that constant. So we made that comparison, and we found that expression of communitarian belief was actually stronger in the people who made real public calls
I mean, what's great about this is, right, we have an objective behavioral measure that we can connect the attitudinal ones to. So we did have a real thing there. And in fact, those who reported greater communitarian behavior also made more calls among custodians. So there is, I think, a real thing there. And what we found was what didn't predict anything was if you said, I use this because I care about property values, didn't predict anything related to your behavior. And so it ended up becoming, in every test we did, a null factor. I think Brian was next.
So, so I wanted to ask you kind of like, I said this stuff's econometrically messy. Like, one example of that is, so these same people that worked on this, we're looking at this thing with electoral responsiveness. We beat Dustin to the experiment a little bit in the sense of one thing we tried to do just because we thought it maybe would be fun was to go out and see if we could clear fire hydrants and see if that would cause other people to clear more often. Just cleaning up the neighborhood. It turns out these things we think they're just too spatially dispersed to pick up any kind of, problem. You didn't see anything, but it was fun to clear them anyway. But one of the things that, as soon as we started doing this, one of the things that we noticed immediately was there would be super violations all over the place. Because we just, people are walking around neighborhoods and like, we're trying to match one neighborhood close to another neighborhood, so we think that they're, well balanced, like people are crossing over them and they're being exposed to these treatments. And it just became a big mess, right? And in some ways, this is related to the classic problems with some of this data, which is that, relates to the fact that, spatial econometrics is almost like this thing field in some ways, is that, you have these things like these modifiable real uniforms, right? And you're taking, and so, let me ask my question. But it's like, the question is, how much do you think that these big data problems or these big data, nature of big data can help get over these things that plague this kind of data forever, right? So like, so you put these things in census blocks, but you didn't have to, I think, to understand. That's the way you just, that's the way you define them just as a measure of convenience, right? But, and then somebody says, well, how do they vary, if you define them some other way? And have you thought about using them to move away from things like census blocks and other things that people always complain about as modifiable?
Yeah, so I use census data primarily because census boundaries because of the administrative data that's associated with it, and it's tough not to. I'm working on a project right now with some folks looking at trying to build a blocks, and blocks at least are, they're atomic in some sense, right? Because it's literally the smallest space that's surrounded by streets and not bisected by any street. And so doing that, it really is an interesting question, and I think the challenge is really going to be then how do you make it relevant, right? If you do blocks and you start aggregating them up based on characteristics, then you can aggregate up as well, ethnic composition, home ownership, things like that are measured at the block level. But where do you get median income from? And so that's been a real challenge. I don't think the big data say much around that, right? They're still constrained by what of the desks are being examined in conjunction with. To the econometric question, I think you're right, and I'm not myself, as you can see, I'm not a modeler, so to speak. I think it would behoove the field, so to speak, to run those sorts of models though and figure out what is consistency. I mean, one could argue, law of big numbers when you have 165,000 calls in a year, that you can start to get to some central tendencies that, regardless of measurement error, things like that, you've covered something. But I think it really raises a big question because error can compound itself pretty easily as well. I really think it takes someone who could really dig and run those simulations to figure out, right, how badly are we violating our assumptions. Question back there and then over here.
So I know that my background in questions that we kind of grapple with is the idea that the geographic extent of your nation is consistent according to age and engagement and all sorts of things. So have you analyzed, have you stratified the distance between caller tone and caller calling in by those sort of obvious demographic crosscuts to see if it holds the literature that younger people, for example, will report a broader range of neighborhoods versus low income?
Really good question. I actually have the data. They're just not. They're not at mind right now. I even have a table. We don't really have time for you to go find that table. If you want to send me an email.
Callers report their
No, they don't, but from the survey that we have, we can analyze that question. I don't remember any obvious things jumping out at me, but you are right. You know, people of different demographic, you know, they differ in what they report to be their neighborhood. Well, this is a little bit different because you're not reporting what your neighborhood, you're engaging with neighborhood. Yeah, I'll check that. If you wanted to drop me an email, I can tell you what the result of that is.
You understand, as I understand, a crucial part of your strategy, and which turned out to be significant in some sense, was this amplification and calibration, which relied on sort of a body of parallel data that wasn't part of the big data world or the administrative data world.
Yeah.
So you're talking about bringing administrative data online in a particular setting, which is the city of Boston. And there's ways to bring it online because there was a history of non-administrative data that had sort of been collected at the same level, I guess, census blocks, regarding some at least related kinds of things. You weren't jumping all the way from the issues of your interest to your student who's working on the arts programs. And for her arts programs, she needed a previous, I mean, well, she might be able to use your neighborhood data to amplify and calibrate her arts data, but it might not work. So this would turn out to be crucial statistically, I guess, but how important is it quantitatively? And as a practical matter, I wonder if we need to, and one interesting question would be, how bad a job do you do if you don't have the previous body of non-administrative data from a decades, if you're not in a city that has had decades of this similar kind of work,
Yeah.
older, more traditional methods.
That's a very interesting question. And for some of them, like for example, my student who's working on a different student, the one who's working on building and growth, right? And using building permits. You know, that's a tough one to know what objectivity is even, right? Because legally speaking, you have to enter a permit if you're going to do something to your house. And so hypothetically, we have the universe of work on house, but obviously there are people who are violating that law, and there may be some errors there. And to be honest, I mean, we've talked about it at length. What we ended up doing was a construct validity approach, right? Just doing correlations and making sure things checked out in a face sense, because I don't know how you would audit that, right? I don't know how you would go door to door and then see if someone was building something and then check the building permit reference. And so there is this very interesting question of, for these different data sets, depending on how good of an objective audit you have, you know, what can you do to validate, or do you admit, you know, in the lengthy limitations section, you know, there is some error here, but no one's been able to measure this before, and nobody knows how to measure this objectively. So at least this is heuristically informative, and so it is an interesting question. Now, for this data set, right, for 311, we've developed a methodology that works in Boston. One might think that a similar methodology could work in Chicago, and maybe if we replicate the study there and we demonstrate that, you know, similar measures work for an adjustment factor, you know, maybe do that there, and maybe do that in New York. You start to get some real evidence that, okay, this works, right? And then small cities like Somerville creates a 311 system. Like, could they just borrow the methodology? And so I think basically as a field we need to figure out how to analyze consistency across these, do some meta-analyses, and then you can start repurposing them in places, as you mentioned, that don't have the institutional capacity to do the work we did. Did that get your question?
Yes.
We can argue about like whether you have a good measure of like objective neighborhood conditions, but it seems like you have a pretty good measure of like the propensity to call about this stuff. You have like something that's sort of uniform across the city, and some neighborhoods call more than others. So I'm wondering if you've looked at like whether that moderates the effect of poverty on crime, or like using more of the propensity to call rather than other methods.
I've done a tiny bit of stuff on that. I've been looking at that more, for one of the earlier questions, more as an outcome variable, because it in itself is sort of novel and fun to think about where it is. And I think a next step, and one that I probably won't get to too soon, but I want to look at is, yes, its own role in the neighborhood ecology, right? How is it influencing things? One thing I can say, I was playing around with some things the other day. This is very preliminary. I'm not sure if it's going to hold, but it looks as though it may actually help to diminish gun-related something about that resource in the neighborhood is lowering guns over time, all else controlled for. But that's very preliminary. It's kind of a direction I need to go in. So.
Is there like a happy 311, like a line that you call to like give a, I don't know, like give a, like say something went. Well, no. Like I sort of like you call the 311 equivalent, and it's to like give a compliment or say, hey, this worked out. Like the public works came in and did a good job, like that.
The city would love to believe that that's the case. The one thing that, I don't know how often it's used, but the one thing they have done effectively is they've put 311 on social media in Boston. And so you could do, I don't know if they have Facebook reporting yet, but I know they have Twitter. And so they actually, they like, when they talk about how great this has been in terms of maintaining the city and how it makes people happy, they do trot out the occasional tweet that says like, thank you, Mayor Menino, for taking care of my pothole. Or dear DPW, I heart you, things like that. And so they have a few of those. I don't know how much that's really happening though.
And compared to again property prices, rental prices.
You mean?
As in, so if property prices are going up, rental prices are going up, that's sort of things going well in this area.
You mean comparing which?
No. That means for me things are going really bad.
Comparing which measure or which?
So it seemed to me that Dustin was looking for a measure of success.
Yeah.
The owners of the property who are renting it out are probably going to be happier when their property values are going up. The owners of the houses, as their property values go up, and it seems pretty closely connected to the general project that we have, evaluating physical disorder in neighborhoods.
That's a really interesting question.
And it's measurable, people track it, people care a lot about it. It's definitely become 101, and it's
Yeah. It's definitely doable. So I think that's a good question.